Thank you to the National Virtual Disability Conference organisers for inviting me to speak today. It is a pleasure to address the conference as a keynote speaker. I also want to thank Alistair McEwen for his opening remarks and his work on the Royal Commission into violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation of people with disability. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. As highlighted by Alistair, today's conference falls almost 1 year after the Disability Royal Commission released its final report with 222 recommendations following 4 years of investigation. Since then, we've had 2 other significant reports. The review of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NDIS review, with its blueprint to renew the promise of the NDIS and deliver a more accessible and inclusive Australia. And the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights inquiry into Australia's human rights framework, the PJCHR inquiry, which recommended, among other things, the introduction of a Human Rights Act and a re-established human rights framework. The government has also just concluded a review of Australia's Disability Strategy 2021 to 2031 to see if it is working as planned and to identify new things that should be included. Combined, this makes for a very extensive disability reform agenda. Last week, the Australian Government released its Disability Reform Roadmap for 2024 and 2025 in response to this reform agenda. It is encouraging to see that the Disability Reform Ministerial Council is focused on progressing the breadth of the reform agenda. The roadmap provides a very high-level set of measures without specific details. However, it does provide the potential for critical engagement for the implementation of the reform agenda and the path forward. It could create fertile soil for sowing the seeds of change necessary for a transformative reform agenda grounded in human rights. This will require dismantling ableism, the normative standard of what it means to be human. Ableism, like sexism, racism, ageism, and other hierarchical power relations, is the underlying power dynamic that perpetuates discrimination and inequality. Ableism is based in the medicalised view of disability that sees impairment as an individual deficit that needs fixing or curing. And when disability is viewed through this lens, it results in policy response that legitimises segregation, institutionalisation, and the denial of personhood and autonomy under the guise of benevolent and benign care, treatment and protection systems. The belief that people with disability are incapable of being part of the community becomes self-evident, and the segregation and exclusion of people with disability from community life is unquestioned. The CRPD challenges ableism by reaffirming a human rights approach for people with disability. This requires turning human rights from laws into effective policies, practices, and practical realities. Human rights principles and standards provide guidance about what should be done and emphasise how human rights are achieved. The disability reform agenda will have to translate the CRPD into practical realities for people with disability. Central to understanding a human rights approach is the human rights model, or conceptualisation of disability. The CRPD recognises disability as a social construct and values impairment as a natural and valued part of human diversity and human dignity. This is where the CRPD moves beyond the social model of disability to the human rights model. It recognises that people with disabilities are rights holders and can exercise and enjoy their human rights on an equal basis with others. It is centred on the principle of non-discrimination, which establishes that impairment should never be the basis for the denial or diminishment of the enjoyment and exercise of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. This shift is the foundational goal of the social transformation required by the CRPD to reframe and reimagine disability policy. Central to the objectives of social transformation are the mutually reinforcing building blocks of the Convention that are indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated with all articles and obligations. This includes, in no priority order, the following. Firstly, equality and non-discrimination. The CRPD reaffirms the principle of equality on an equal basis with others and the legal standard of non-discrimination. People with disability are equal in value and worth. For example, in the context of the disability reform agenda, legal, policy and practice measures that promote and perpetuate segregation on the basis of impairment are prima facie discrimination. Secondly, equal recognition before the law. The CRPD reaffirms that people with disability are subjects of rights and can exercise rights on an equal basis with others in all aspects of life. It is central to the individual autonomy and personhood and to having agency over one's life. Among other things, the disability reform agenda needs to ensure that supported decision-making is a reality for people with disability so they can make their own decisions based on their own will and preference and have those decisions respected. Thirdly, full and effective participation and inclusion in society. The CRPD reinforces that inherent dignity, autonomy and independence requires universal design of infrastructure, products, environments, programs and services. The disability reform agenda needs to ensure that participation and inclusion is not solely reliant on the NDIS. There needs to be broad mainstream system reform that facilitates personal autonomy and independence. Finally, but no means least, the voice and active participation of people with disability. The raison d'etre of the CRPD is the human rights violations that occur because people with disability are not afforded a voice in their own lives. Based on the quintessential, non-negotiable ingredient of nothing about us without us, the CRPD addresses the exclusion and marginalisation of people with disability by requiring their active participation and involvement in decisions that affect them, including in all aspects of law, policy and practice. This is the framework through which law, policy and practice reform should occur, and to realise transformative equality. Transformative equality requires positive measures to be taken to dismantle existing frameworks underpinned by ableism, to facilitate the inclusion of people with disability in society. It is not simply about overcoming barriers to rights, but seeks to address the underlying causes of their denial. People with disability can no longer be segregated in housing, education and work, denied their personhood and autonomy through substitute decision-making systems, be subjective to restrictive practices and coercive treatment, be deprived of their liberty on the basis of impairment, or experience attitudinal, communication, and environmental barriers to all aspects of community life. We need to unlearn old systems, relearn new approaches, and rebuild our law and policy frameworks to underpin a new default way of thinking. Embedding a human rights approach to reform requires leadership and a commitment to change how we currently do things and to examine what is holding us back from transformative equality. The disability reform agenda provides an opportunity for national and global leadership in addressing ableism, inequality, segregation and discrimination, and it is critical that this opportunity is not lost. Key opportunities for strong leadership and reform that will ensure those critical elements are accepted and integral to transformative disability reform agenda include a strengthened regulatory framework through amendments to the Disability Discrimination Act, including modernisation and consolidation across the full suite of Commonwealth anti-discrimination laws. A revitalised human rights framework, including a National Human Rights Act, to embed the CRPD in strong human rights protection. Implementation across Australia of the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, OPCAT, including national preventive mechanisms in all jurisdictions. A nationally consistent, supported decision-making framework to facilitate personal autonomy and to recognise the legal capacity of people with disability. Mechanisms to end segregation in housing and employment, and a national roadmap for inclusive education. Rights-based reform to the NDIS and a reimagining of the disability services and supports model to ensure individualised and participant-led support that facilitates full and effective participation and inclusion in society. Formal mechanisms to ensure people with disability through their representative organisations are central to the implementation and monitoring of the CRPD and to decision-making processes affecting their lives. The quote that inspired the theme of today's conference is from the formidable Professor Gerard Quinn, the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In his statement to the Disability Royal Commission, Professor Quinn was clear that to achieve the objectives and obligations of the CRPD, states must adopt new ways of thinking, away from the default approach that upholds systems of exclusion, reflective of the medical model of disability, and based on the material difference of impairment. To get there, Professor Quinn spoke of the need to disentangle our thinking about equality and the medical model and tackle the exclusion ethic across many domains and policy areas. The CRPD provides us with a comprehensive roadmap to achieve the social transformation required to end the inequality, discrimination and segregation that are the enablers of the violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation experienced by people with disability. This will require embracing the legal and policy standards provided by the CRPD to make the conceptual shift that impairment is a valued part of human diversity and human dignity. That impairment should never be the basis for the denial or diminishment of human rights. That disability is socially constructed, and that transformation is required to dismantle underlying power relations in law, policy and practice frameworks to ensure equality. If our focus remains on fixing or reforming existing systems built on ableism, the necessary transformation required by the CRPD will not be understood or realised. As Professor Quinn eloquently put it, the difficulty of achieving it shouldn't hold us back from committing to beginning that journey wholeheartedly. The journey will require the collective effort of all stakeholders, including policymakers, service providers, advocates, and the disability community. I look forward to the discussions and insights that will emerge from today's conference. I understand we have a short Q&A session, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.